Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Fundamentalists Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Elliott Morgan, and I'm here with your second host, Dr. Peter Rollins. Today, we're going to be
Hello.
discussing Noam Chomsky. We're going to be discussing Lacan, Foucault, however you say his name, maybe even a little bit of Zizek. We're going to be talking about things like postmodernism, things like justice and power, and other ideas that I'm not entirely sure what they mean. The reason we're talking about this week, folks, is because Chomsky is one of those names I hear all the time. He'll pop up in everything from intellectual discourse to some of my favorite rap lyrics, namely Run the Jewels. Such lines as I'm reading Chomsky, I'm reading Bukowski, something like that. Anyway, I hear his name all the time, and I never hear my buddy Pete talk about Chomsky. I don't know why that is. It's not on the tip of Pete's tongue very often. I wonder if there are some ideological differences. I don't know. I'd love to find out, and I'd love to find out what it is that Chomsky even believes. And hey, I got an idea. Let's talk about postmodernism. Is there any truth in it? Who can say? Pete, how are you?
That was brilliant. Well done.
You get
I
it?
didn't know Run the Jewels mentioned Chomsky. So of
Yeah,
course
killer
that's
my
your
gut. I'm
interest.
reading Chomsky. I'm reading Bukowski. I'm laying low for a week. I said something on behalf of my people, and I popped up in WikiLeaks. See, I know all the rap. This is just gonna be me reciting rap lyrics. Anyway,
That's where you get all of your academic stuff
it
from.
really
That's
is. Yeah.
right.
Well,
Uh,
who is he? And I know Chomsky's a linguist, and I know Chomsky. I watched a 12-minute clip of him. I've seen him badmouth people like Lacan. I've heard him talk about postmodernists as people who no one understands what they're talking about. I think that's humorous. I think he's not entirely wrong. But people like Foucault, who seem, am I saying it? What? How do you say his name? Foucault. Foucault.
Fuku. Fuku.
Foucault. Foucault seems like a charming French intellectual with no shortage of ego when I watched briefly the debate. And so, what are
He
these
looks
guys'
very cool.
positions?
He's a very cool guy,
Very
Fuku.
cool
Yeah.
guy. Yeah, very Bond villainy, and seems very. I'd like to hang out with him, but these this postmodern business, everybody makes a big hoopla out of it. It's used to be all the rage in the 80s. Now apparently not so much, but the remnants of it are still with us. What's Chomsky's thing, and how does it fit in with the unconscious?
Yeah, well, I thought when you mentioned this, I thought that you're trying to be edgy and kind of the moment because it was only 10 years ago when Chomsky dissed Shiazak, and I thought
Yes,
10 years has passed. Now you wanna jump into that
I
very
got
hot
something to
debate.
say.
Yep, that's because we don't like to do anything too topical, but there was
No,
a
no.
moment. Yeah, it must have been 10 years ago, and Chomsky was asked. He might have said this a few places, but it was on a podcast I remember, and he was asked, "What does he think about Slavoj Žižek?" And he was like, "I don't think anything of him." I say he's posturing. It's empty theory. When you strip away the big words, you're kind of left with nothing. And they said, "Well, what do you think of Lacan?" And he was like, "Well, I actually knew Lacan a little bit. He was a very interesting guy, quite charismatic, but a complete charlatan." And the person actually said, "Well, would you ever have a discussion with Shiazak? You're both of the left, and you're both interested in some similar things." And Chomsky, being a bit of a grumpy old man by this stage, was just like, "Nope, wouldn't want to talk to him." And he said, and I think probably Shiazak would feel the same way, but Shiazak was a little bit nicer in his response. So that's. But did you hear about that? Uh,
Yes,
this, yeah,
I am, and I'm more interested in the petty drama than I am in what their ideas are, and I want to put that on the table
absolutely.
before we get too deep into this.
Absolutely. Well, so that was the shots fired, and that was kind of interesting because people have a lot of respect for Chomsky, or have had, and also, there's a lot of respect for Shizak. So this was a big deal among some people, um, and then Shizak's response was he just did a very brief response as well in a I think it was a talk. Someone asked him about it, and he did have some interesting things to say. Uh, first thing he said was he said, well, Chomsky loves, good American pragmatist. He likes empirical evidence, scientific
Yes,
evidence. Doesn't like all of this theory crap. He likes theory, but he thinks all of this continental French European theory is all just kind of big words, empty. But Zizek said, but um, Chomsky, who loves empiricism and loves kind of, to use empirical predictions, um, doesn't realize that actually you can find what's going to happen in the world by listening to people's theory. So he uses the example of the Khmer Rouge, where he said there was a point where Chomsky was defending the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, defending what they were doing, and eventually it came out the Khmer Rouge was very bloody and violent party, and thousands of deaths on their hands. And Chomsky's response was, well, at the time that I was defending them, there wasn't the empirical evidence. The murders, the deaths, all of that didn't exist. And Shizak's response was, but you didn't need the empirical evidence. It was all in the theory. It was all in what they were saying. It was how they were organized. And so that was the first thing Shizak says is, theory can often tell you what's empirically going to happen. If you don't need to think that, you don't have to wait till Hitler starts killing Jews to know that that's potentially on the cards from looking at Mein Kampf. By looking at kind of the words, you can kind of sometimes get a sense of where it's going. And then secondly, he said, a lot of these guys like Chomsky kind of seem to imply that ideology is dead. All of this ideological critique, forget about that. Just look at the facts, expose the truth, show how, say, big corporations are amounting so much power and money, or influencing governments, or lying behind the scenes, or manipulating us with the media. Show people that stuff. Forget about ideology. And Shizak's point on that is, well, actually, ideology is alive and well. You can't just show people the truth, because people act against their own self-interest. People act in denial. People get caught up in things. So Shizak's going, the ideology critique and the theory of ideology critique is still alive and well. And then thirdly, he responded to Chomsky's thing that, these are just popular fads. These are just kind of, academic fads. But Shizak pointed out, and I think there's some truth to this, that actually they're not that popular. I mean, Shizak is very well known, but actually very sidelined in the university, very sidelined in the mainstream, often ridiculed as a bit of a clown. And then paradoxically also is incredibly dangerous. So symptomatically, you're a clown who's, not to be taken seriously, and also incredibly dangerous. So, Shizak's going, that was his kind of like off the cuff response to Chomsky. So that was the initial beef between the two of them.
Like, I'm living rent free in your head. That phrase. Shizak,
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, he should have just said that.
Yeah, I like to, and I know it was 10 years ago, so I don't know if that phrase was all the rage then, but I mean, that's okay. All right. And so Zizek, so ideology, and then so Foucault,
yes,
he makes this point, and this is where I feel like, I get the general stances. What how do we mix these ideas together so that it's not so, like, isn't it true that sometimes there's a little bit of a, I don't know, masturbatory cadence to a lot of the intellectual postmodern stuff? And isn't it true that theory is beneficial on a material level sometimes? Why can't we all get along, Pete?
Yes. Well, that very beautifully said, sir.
I'm an enlightened centrist, I believe.
Yes. Oh dear, the worst. You'll get shot by both. Whoever gets into power, you're going to be against the wall.
Yep.
Yeah. So this famous debate happened in 1971 in the Netherlands, as you know, between Fuku and Chomsky, and this was it's one of the most famous debates, public debates that is around. It's kind of almost like the way the Shizak-Peterson debate was this massive thing, and people were buying tickets. This is a big deal. Chomsky and Fuku, two intellectual superstars, both kind of on the left, but both very different. And actually, I haven't listened to that debate for 20 years. In fact, there was part of me wondering whether I ever had listened to it or just knew about it. So when I watched it today, I thought it was amazing. Very interesting. They were very respectful of each other. It was an interesting conversation. Yeah, it was lovely. And it wasn't this kind of thing of, Foucault destroyed Chomsky or Chomsky murdered Foucault, like it would be if it was a YouTube debate today. It was like two people discussing really interesting issues. And I think everything about the continental analytic divide and everything about Chomsky's criticism of post-structuralism and vice versa is all very subtly in this debate. So if we go through it, there's 4 parts to it. I think it'll really clarify Chomsky's issue with continental philosophy, and I think why he's wrong. So
this is, I mean, this is what brings in the money, Pete. Let's get started.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. I put into ChatGPT today, how do you make a boring philosophy podcast popular? And its response was, yes, it says, it is very difficult to make an esoteric philosophy podcast popular. However, here are some tips. Thank you, ChatGPT.
Thank you, ChatGPT.
So yeah, the debate was in 4 parts. The first part was about human nature. The second part was about science. The third part about ideal society, and the fourth part about justice. And these all build on each other, so they're all actually really intertwined. So do you want me to go ahead and talk about the first part and what they're discussing, and then we'll just do all 4 parts? So the first part, that's where Chomsky kind of outlines in a very basic way his position, where he says there is a human nature, and what human nature is we acquire language. There's something innate within us that, even though we're not even taught it very well, sometimes we're just listening to language. The babies, it's not systematic. It's not like they're in school, but they're surrounded by signifiers, and the infant is able to bring those signifiers in to kind of use them, and also to be creative with them, to kind of find themselves in language and be able to do creative stuff with that language. So Fuku starts and goes, so there is something, and he calls it kind of human nature, something that we all share as human beings. And Fuku's response, which is very subtle and very simple, what's that? Is no.
Nope.
Nope.
Yeah, I assume he was going to be like, no, right out of the gate, I disagree.
I disagree. That would be if it was today, but this is very, very subtle. And he just said, he used the example in science and biology. He said, where some scientific theories solve problems and kind of give us insight, and some articulate a new series of problems and a new series of questions. And he said, linguistics doesn't necessarily solve a lot of problems. It opens up a new field of inquiry. And so what Foucault's very subtly saying is, let's not use the term human nature in a substantive way. Like, this thing about language is really interesting, and Chomsky, you're doing something really, really cool. But I'm wary of using this term human nature as if it's a substantive thing. Like, we have something within us that's substantively human.
As if there's a universal human nature that is at the base of all of every human's actions. Because there's no way, because the human natures that we all have are so informed by outside factors that to willy-nilly say that there's one sort of platonic human nature is not the case. Is that what he's saying?
Yeah. And that's it. And this becomes, by the time you get to the end, it becomes kind of clear what he's saying. But that is kind of the subtle thing. Like, he's almost saying that every time someone tries to describe what human nature is, there's self-interest, there's power behind it. That the definition of human nature reflects the scientific discourse of the time. It reflects the economic conditions of the time. It reflects who's in power. And it's almost like, and this is the subtle thing, Chomsky's not saying that there isn't this universal ability to use language. But what he's kind of saying is, as soon as you make it some substantive claim, you're in danger of reflecting the values of the given society. It becomes dangerous.
Yeah.
But that's very subtly he's saying that.
You can't say in a vacuum. It's going to be contaminated with these other things.
Yeah. And so, I mean, he doesn't say this, and Foucault's got a different view to Lacan here, but you could almost say that Foucault was saying that there's something about language that isn't substantive. It's almost like there's a questioning that provokes language. So, we speak because we want to understand, because we are trying to grasp the world. And so it's not that we have a substantive human nature, it's more that we are all marked by a question. But as soon as you try to say exactly what human nature is, that's where you get into trouble.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so that's the least interesting one. That kind of, as I say, it gets progressively more insightful as it goes along. You see where this is going. So, because the second one, more controversially, is where Foucault says that our view of science. Oh, and here's the thing: Chomsky in all of these is kind of representing the common sense view. So, very common sense to say, oh, there's a human nature. There's something we can say about what it is to be human.
Yeah.
The second is quite a common sense position, which is that science gets us closer to truth, that there is a revelatory dimension to science. And as we develop more sophisticated techniques, better technology, we kind of we hone our theories, we get to know the universe in deeper and more complex ways. And Foucault, controversially, says that...
Wrong
says,
again.
Nope. Yep.
Gonna stop you right there.
Yeah. He wants to say, he doesn't want to say that science is relativistic, but he kind of wants to say, and he does use the term grid, he says, a discourse is like a grid that reveals the world, but it also conceals it. So biology reveals the world in a certain way, chemistry reveals the world in a certain way, poetry and physics, they all reveal the world in different ways, and they also conceal the world in various ways. So whenever you're looking at the world from a biological position, there's a dimension
you miss everything. You miss poetry.
Yes.
Yeah.
You miss poetry. So all of these different discourses reveal and conceal the world. And so Foucault's going, like, if we go with this purely objectivist notion of science, again, he's going, listen, the people in power are the ones who are going to pretend that they own it and speak in whenever they speak as an avatar of science. The science says, I am science. So, and he says, be very careful. Again, scientific discourse does reveal the world, and it also conceals the world, and there's power dynamics. Who's funding the research? Where is it coming from? Who does it benefit? All of these questions Foucault wants to throw in the mix.
It is interesting because it's like I can see why the eye rolls come in a little bit from when you're like, no, it's not that. Like it's the and it's I can see why on one hand why it's a fascinating line of inquiry, and on the other hand why the common sense view for so many people is like, whatever. Like, I mean, especially too if you're starting to talk about society and structuring society politically, then I get the idea or the frustration of like relying so heavily on these theories and the realization that certain things are going to benefit the powerful at the expense, like using that as an excuse to not make to then throw out science altogether or throw out policies that materially benefit people. So it's yes. I can see why people are like, why are you even bringing this up if what people need right now is more important than whatever the actual concealment of reality is going on. Does that make it?
No, absolutely. And that's one
another argument.
Yeah, and that's Chomsky's critique outside of this would be someone like Foucault is kind of like everything. It leads to a form of relativism and a form of not being able to act. You kind of like almost it's impotence. It leads to impotence because you're always questioning, and you're questioning what's right and what's wrong and what's just and unjust, and you don't take a stand. So yeah, that's Chomsky's worry, is all of this stuff of questioning science is like it just leads to more passive civilization, more passive citizens.
Wow. Yeah, great. Totally.
And I think some of that's true. I mean, like Foucault in some ways is a lot about showing how, every discourse, like psychiatry to the church, to medicine, to the judicial system, are all confining, restricting, negative things. But you kind of almost, whenever you're reading him, it's like, everything is basically, is repressing us and oppressing us in different ways. And then of course Chomsky would be annoyed because he'd go like, well, you have to have a view, and Chomsky says this actually in the fourth part. But he says you have to have a vision of justice. Or you have to have a vision of an ideal society to work towards. But Fuku wants to reject that. He wants to say, no, no, no,
Mm-hmm.
that's actually the problem. Which
Interesting.
is part three, actually. Yeah, like, so part three is exactly where they talk about ideal society. And, Chomsky here says you have to have an idea of the type of society you want. He's an anarcho-syndicalist. He has a view of kind of how society should run. And
And
Foucault,
what is
this is
that?
where Foucault, uh, what,
Anarcho-syndicalist. What does that mean?
yeah. So basically, anarcho-syndicalism is direct democracy. So the people, like, uh, unions and workers own the means of production, vote and decide things in small syndicates, small groups, no big government, no, so the state is pretty much um, done away
Not
with,
there.
or, so whereas in Marxism, there's a real rule for the state, for government, anarcho-syndicalists kind of want to get rid of all of that. And it's small groups kind of, I say, vote on how to run a business or what to do in terms of running the society. Everyone gets a vote. So that's kind
Okay.
of narco-syndicalism. And this is where Foucault, uh, it says something more. He's been very subtle in the first two sections. This section, he comes out and he says, no, no, he says, first of all, I don't have a view of what an ideal society is. And then he basically says, um, and having one of those is the problem. Whenever you have an ideal version of how society should run, that really just reflects something of the values of the current system. And Foucault then gives his alternative political position. And he basically says, uh, politics is not giving ideal worlds. That's what Stalin did. That's what the 20th century did. They all had grand visions about how society should run, and that all falls into disaster. Foucault says politics should just expose how the current systems are in favor of the few over the masses. And if you can expose how the power of society is in the hands of very few, and you continue to expose that, then the workers will become more and more dissatisfied with that and overthrow the minority, and then power will be more evenly distributed. But he says, but I don't know what that's going to look like. That's just the role is just to show where power is kind of held and kind of expose it.
So all the power could be completely inverted to the masses, and it still would not in any way produce a society that's necessarily better.
Yeah, so that's actually was Chomsky's point. Chomsky said, well, this brings us actually to the fourth section. Chomsky's kind of going, well, hold on. Um, if it's just about exposing power and then new people taking power, then you're just repeating the same problem. What's better about that, right? So you've got like
Yeah.
one group that has power, and then some other group rises up, takes over, and it's the same show, just different faces. Uh, and Foucault makes the argument. He doesn't make the argument in detail, but he wants to say that by definition, if the working class rise up, he wants to say that that will be more equitable. Like that's because basically the working class because the working class becomes everybody. So if the working
Yeah.
class rise up and take the means of production, then without any theory of justice, you're just going, it's going to be better because it's direct democracy. It's kind of everybody has a say. That's Foucault's, but Chomsky's kind of rejecting that and going, no, you have to have a theory of justice. You have to have an ideal. You can't just you can't just say that you have to expose power structures and that's all you have to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. I mean,
but
you're
I'm
really
more with
blown.
Foucault
This is
here.
great stuff. This is what's that?
Oh yeah, I'm kind of more with Foucault in that than Chomsky because I always worry that when people do have ideal visions of what society should look like, those are dangerous people.
You can just say my name, but I know
Yeah.
exactly what society should look like. And I because it looks like um how it is in the game Zelda. There is a um multiple different types of towns that you can roam around in, but there is a dreadful evil that is infecting all of the land, and so you have to then go kill that evil. Um, but you also can wait as much time as you want before doing that and roam around and still just be fighting like little bits of evil here and there. So while you're never structurally fixing what's going on in Hyrule, you are walking through the land and grow. You're gaining more strength. You're becoming a better fighter, a better hero of time, as it were. And so I think that's what an ideal society is, where there is a giant looming threat all the time that you kind of just ignore until you feel like it.
Very good. Yes, that's
Thank
some
you.
people say it's like fair trade. Fair trade. The system. There's a big overarching horrible system,
Yes.
but if we do little small things that are good, it actually perpetuates it because we keep it not being so insufferably
Exactly.
bad that it
Yes.
keeps going for. Yeah, that's good.
Well,
Yeah.
I think if there was more diversity in commercials, for example,
Yes, that is the main issue. Yes.
that's the main issue. Yes, specifically Dove commercials or whatever. Dove for men. So okay, he gets into this ideal of justice. I like having an ideal of justice, and I also, here's my question to you, Pete. This Falcout's ideal, or lack of having an ideal for justice. Do you, as someone who has this sort of Lacanian background, do you think it is possible for someone to say that they don't have some kind of ideal of justice, whether it is like well defined or whatever? I have a hard time believing that even Fuku didn't have some level of, like, in the back of his mind, amorphous idea that he's sort of going like, oh, I don't have an idea. Like, I bet you do a little bit, right?
Well, yeah, and funnily enough, there is a point in the debate. It's a very small point, but it kind of touches, I think, on what you're saying, or it might. Let's see if it does. But where the interviewer is asking Fuku why he doesn't talk about his own personal interests and his personal life. Now, Fuku had a very interesting personal life. Like he knew how to party. But
Yeah, hold on a
uh,
second.
yeah, but Fuku kind of gets a bit frustrated by this question. And I feel the same way. But in that, Foucault's going like, it doesn't matter what I think. In other words, like, of course, I have my own personal views about life and my personal views about how my life would be better or how society would be better. But he's going, but that's not what we're doing in this public forum. We're trying to work out, how society operates, how progress happens or doesn't, how change occurs, trying to figure out those mechanisms. And of course we all have our own personal preferences or personal ideas, but Foucault's but that's not interesting. So that, I think that was Foucault's way of going, yes, of course, yeah, we all have these views, but actually that's very much what we have to protect ourselves against in some ways. So like for Foucault, and this is where he is a lot of people today like him, a lot of identity politics people like Foucault, because Foucault, he actually says this in the debate. He says the role of the political activist is to expose how seemingly universal objective things like human nature, science, ideal society, and justice, to show that they really benefit only a small number of people. To show
That
that
they are
those,
weapons of the state.
yes,
They're
exactly.
riverbeds of libidinal power dispersed by the 1%, showered, raining down upon the weak masses, who only will rise up when the powers at be are exposed for their implicit horrors, which they perpetrate on everyone.
Very well said. Yes, and that's exactly, yeah. That's where that view comes from. So Foucault is the reason why he is the darling of a certain type of politics today. And of course, I've said before in this podcast, but in light of Foucault, the thing I want to add to that is that there is a universal, but the universal is negativity or death drive or the unconscious. So it's not that there is a substantive universal, nor is it there is no universal. There's just power and flows of power and resistances of
Yeah.
power, which is kind of Foucaultian thing. But rather, there is actually something we all share, and it's lack itself. And you have to build a political program around that. But that's not what they were talking about. So that's
the
yeah.
Lacanian. That's your plug.
Yeah.
That's your Lacanian plug, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, someone's got to get some PR people for going for some of these guys, some of these ideas. Foucault Lacan. I cannot get his name, and I'm refusing to even.
I know you're refusing to even try. I like that.
Yeah, and that's my
Yeah.
motto.
So, because some people say, I don't know, do you watch a little bit of it? But some people, I think, thought that, like, Chomsky really won or something. One is I thought they were both very respectful, just having a good conversation. But I thought Fuku came across pretty well in this. I don't know, like
Yeah.
I thought in my back of my head, I thought people really felt Fuku didn't come out looking good, but I thought he looked pretty
I
good.
thought in the 12 minutes I saw while I was laying in bed as soon as I woke up, I thought both of them, they just seemed like highly articulate, incredibly intelligent individuals, and like you're saying, there wasn't a lot of hooping and hollering either. It was like you could actually
Yes.
listen to these guys talk, and then both of them were able to like succinctly reply to the other one, even though there's a language barrier the whole time, which is just like crazy to me, and still like be friendly and direct. It was very nice. It was like no not a lot of hot air between them, just very
Yeah.
very tight.
It was
Still
it was an English speaker and a French speaker in a Danish speaking country. So
Really?
there you
Yeah.
go, yeah.
Great. Yeah, I just got a text from my dad. So if I was telling Pete before the podcast started that my parents are in Belfast and they're on a cruise, except my dad has COVID and now has he just said he's looking at Ireland, looking at Belfast, and he will not like he's happy to be able to see it, but he will never set foot on it, apparently.
Oh, that's
'Cause
so
he can't,
depressing. Because I would love to bring
yeah.
them out. So I say to your
Oh,
mum,
yeah,
I didn't.
yeah.
Elliott just literally told me this before we went on. His parents are actually here. I'm like, my goodness, I'll show them
I
around.
know.
So if your
Pete
mum
can
wants to see,
yeah, Pete can see the cruise ship from his home, which is cute.
yeah.
You're closer to my parents than I am, Pete, in more ways than one.
Yes, I was going to say, literally
So
and
what is
figuratively.
Chomsky does a bunch of stuff in linguistics. He does the common sense thing. He's got his idea of justice. He says we need to strive for it. Science gives us access to truth, yada yada yada. This postmodern business, this whole
Yes,
everything's
yes.
up for grabs with Fuku. He's got this do you, like you're saying, does it not overly muddy the waters so much that it does the very thing, it obscures more than reveals as a result of being so like lattice work, like it's everything's so connected to everything that you start seeing the connections and more so than you see everything else behind it. I'm reading this book, or excuse me, I'm about to start reading this book, listening rather, called Elite Capture. And it's by a guy whose name I can't pronounce. And I want to talk about it on the podcast at some point because I found him in an interview, and it's about how identity politics was stolen by the powerful. Oops. Just started. Stop. Yeah, how the powerful took over identity politics and everything else. And it sounds like a similar argument to what Foucault said.
And there is, I don't know much about this. I have to look into it, but there's all of this interesting debate, even conspiracy theory, but it might be true that like the CIA partly were funding some of these postmodern journals in France.
Really?
Because so there's, I think that part is actually true, that there was, and I think, well, the argument that some people make, and forgive me, I haven't gone into this in detail, but that CIA were really kind of promoting a lot of the postmodern stuff, precisely because it kind of it kind of led to a lot of confusion and a lot of impotence within the left.
Whoa.
So yeah.
Correct me
Quite
if I'm
interesting.
wrong. That sounds like one of the funniest things. That sounds very funny.
Yeah, I know.
So
It's
the
kind of
whole the whole system, or the whole thought process of sticking it to the man and redistributing power was being funded by the state, like potentially.
Yes,
And
absolutely. Well,
you think
sure,
this is
remember,
true?
yeah.
Is this?
Well, there's some. I need to look into the background of it, but it's definitely true in the sense of I remember some adverts coming out. An advert for the CIA came out a few years ago, and an advert for the army, and I saw both of these adverts that they completely bought into kind of woke and identitarian politics. One of them was this, I think it was a lesbian black woman who was telling her story, and she was a missile operator for the American military, and the CIA one was very similar. And now that's actually different, but that shows how that's what you're saying is like there's a co-opting of these ideas because potentially they're not they're about they're not about redistribution, they're about representation. In other words, it's not about changing the system, it's just about getting more diverse figures in the system. Like in that famous Lisa Simpson quote, the problem with society is there's not enough female billionaires, right? So it's like
Yeah.
it doesn't critique the system, it just kind of kind of like changes the faces. So that's one of the arguments of this is, yeah, it doesn't have political legs. And I'm not a Fukuian, so I used to be a post-structuralist of sorts, and I think there's something true to all of that. I think it does lack teeth.
Yeah, I think the argument I heard was the same structural problems that lead to the these the need for some kind of identity the argument being identity politics have been around forever, and the other
Mm,
argument is that identity politics specifically, the need for them is still r- stems from the very class structural issues that underlie the economy. Like it's all the same. It all goes back to the same power dynamics where it all gets
yeah,
funneled toward the top. And so it was some sort of like the class reductionist argument of the left where everything goes down to class is like true, but also that the fact that it goes down to class ultimately doesn't mean that those things still do not create all these other kinds of inequalities, I guess. Does that
it's
argument hold
yeah.
water with you, or does that even make sense? That's what I heard. I don't know. I'm always trying to wrap my head around this and make sure. I just want to make sure everyone likes me. So that's the way I'm approaching
Yes. Well, you've lost that battle.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they say that actually some people have made the argument. There's one author who argued this. I forget her name, but had that identity politics was pretty much invented in Northern Ireland. Not invented in terms of theoretically, but invented as a political tool. And because so I grew up during the Troubles, it was very identity politics, and what you ended up doing is people were fighting about Catholics and Protestant and all of that, when
Yeah.
really the issue was economic, and there was a lot of like so working class Protestants and working class Catholics had more in common than a working class Protestant with a middle class Protestant, but because everything was about identity, what church, what religion. And the irony is, this was not even people with different skin color. This was literally all kind of white guys talking about Catholicism and Protestantism, not even two different religions. This isn't even Islam and Christianity. This is literally, are you a Protestant or a Catholic?
It's
And
great.
everything, and yeah, and it kind of destroyed us. We were in a 30-year war, and it was only when we, in 1998, put down our weapons and kind of realized that we had more in common than what divided us, and that there were all these economic problems that we had to address, and that change could happen. So there is a real interesting connection between Northern Ireland and identity politics, and I think that's what worries me so much. When I lived in America, I was like, oh, I've seen this before. Oh, like I've seen where this goes. I lived through this. This
Yeah.
increasing division. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's always legitimate. It's always justified. Oh, wait, keep going.
Yeah. Good point. The Chomsky thing, people, I kind of will see him pop up, and the responses are usually like not. He doesn't seem to be super popular these days, and I don't know what the
Yeah.
deal is. And I'm not in this, like, I don't follow him much, but I don't get in either direction. When I hear him talk, sometimes I'm just like, the worst I can say is he's kind of boring a little bit. Like, I think he's
Mhm.
he's smart, but it does kind of make me go like, okay, like maybe that's the common sense thing, but maybe that's what the criticism is. I don't know why people don't like him. What's your besides,
Yeah.
like, it's like a vitriolic, there's like a personal, like, this kind of thing, and I'm like, I don't know, but maybe that's just how people are with all these people. I don't know.
Well, that's true as well. But it is interesting because he used to be, and he is like people respect Chomsky, and I respect him and from the past, but I have not been impressed by his recent stuff. I mean, I'm not saying because he's very sharp still, but he's like very elderly. He's you know, making comments about things like, including my friend Danny's here is reminding me about, makes comments about kind of like technology and stuff. And I just feel his finger's not as on the pulse as it used to be. But
Yeah.
the big thing, one of the things for me that I don't know whether this is why, uh, maybe I find him not very interesting in yourself, is he does not have any space for the unconscious. He doesn't have any space for death drive. He doesn't. So there's a dimension to Chomsky, and it's in that 1971 seminar, one where he thinks that we can talk substantively about things, I think we can as well, but in a very particular way. But you can talk substantively. This is what justice is. This is what the ideal society is. Bam, bam, bam. Here's anarcho-syndicalism. This is how things should run. And this idea that all we need to do is present people with the better ideas and give people knowledge, and people, when they're educated, will kind of like, see the truth. One of the things that I think people liked about the psychoanalysts when they started doing political theory was that they were saying we often act against their own self-interest. We can know the good that we should do and we don't do it. That there's a dimension, a self-destructive dimension to us. And so the old liberal notion of just educating people is not enough. We have to somehow understand and work with this dimension that people often vote against their own self-interest. They often act against the interests of their community. And you don't have any of that in Chomsky. Chomsky is kind of just this very old school kind of showing some really good things, like the violence of the industrial war machine, and bringing up some important stuff there. But I just don't think, because he kind of doesn't really do theory, I think he misses a whole dimension of political life.
It seems like it also means that the critiques that he can offer for, say, maybe the right would have not a lot of water. It was just that it sounds like it'd be that whole thing of like, well, they're just clearly all bad. Like all the people on the other side of the political spectrum must be bad, because if you have no death drive, no like nuance for people acting in their own best interest, then when you see people voting in a way you disagree with, I guess your only conclusion has to be that they're just straight up wrong. Which
you get that.
Fine,
but you get that in Chomsky. You kind of feel like it's non-dialectical. It's like, there's now this is simple. I wouldn't say it quite like this, but sometimes you do feel that there's the goodies and the baddies. There's the ones, so there's people say get vaccinated, and the baddies who don't. Not seeing how these can be different forms of enjoyment and different forms of being intertwined, and I worry about that type of approach.
Yeah, because if you look at it reminds me of, you're talking about the co-opting of something like identity politics, and then on the right you have the co-opting of like religious life or fundamentalist stuff, which I'm assuming is related to what your early work was on, so much of the deconstruction stuff that people still love very much, and I'm always fascinated by, because it is a whole world out there. It's been interesting to talk with like Grace sometimes about, she didn't grow up religious or anything like that in any substantial way, and seeing the kinds of the world of people deconstructing from their faith, and how it very much like ties into their political shifts as well. It's all very like interesting to kind of have to explain and show, because it's very complex, and you do see that there's all of these reasons behind it. It's not just that people are dumb, that they are bad. It just is there's so many factors. It's crazy.
Yeah, and people do kind of like, even if you disagree with Fuku, and saying, like, okay, there's power behind everything, right? Maybe somebody doesn't want to go that far, but you also to go, like, whenever people leave sometimes religious conservatism, but they can buy into some other thing like commodity satisfaction, or sexual liberation, or psychedelic enlightenment. Nothing wrong with any of these things, but if that just becomes the new, this is the vision, then in one sense you're potentially going, okay, are we still caught up in thinking that we have a substantive vision of the future? Now, I do the same thing, so I'm guilty as well, but what I try to remind myself is, in Northern Ireland, with the peace process, it wasn't a progressive thing, it was an apocalyptic thing. We literally didn't know what the future would look like. We just knew that it couldn't go on like this. There was so much violence and destruction, and we all had to sit down and go, right, I'm going to lay down my vision of the perfect society, that united Ireland, where we stay part of the UK, or the dismantling of the police force or not, right? I have to lay down my vision of the of what should happen in Northern Ireland and engage in this conflictual back and forth and negotiate and navigate something. And that was a very successful peace process, but it was apocalyptic in the sense that you didn't know what the future looked like. So an apocalypse is, yeah, an event and you don't know what's on the other side of it. And that's kind of what Foucault was saying. He's going like, whenever progressives, they can love you, but they know where the future's going. So if you disagree with them, they can patronize you, whatever, but they know what the future looks like. And Foucault wants to say something always dangerous about saying, I know. Now, of course, I do know, but nobody else does.
Yes,
And that's
that's
the
true.
problem. Yep. Yep.
That is your problem. You are correct.
Yeah.
That the problem is that you are correct. And that is unfortunate. I was thinking what came to my mind was a certain irony of the sort of not knowing what the future looks like and this idea of images. And I thought about the Titanic and this essay I read on the idea of Titanism and the sort of imageless power that can overtake people at times, and the future being that sort of Titanic imageless thing that is bearing down on us all the time. And then I remembered that the Titanic was built literally right behind you, where my parents are
Yeah.
hanging out
Where
right
your
now.
parents
Isn't
are.
that nice?
They
Yeah.
can see the Titanic Museum. Your dad will never set foot in it, but they
Yeah,
are right
exactly.
where
Very
it was
funny.
built. Yeah. And this is what an event is. An event is the happening of something that you cannot see. So there's things that we can predict. There's things that we know are going to potentially kind of happen. But an event is when something, either in our own lives, like falling in love or something, but also politically, some conflict, something happens, and it just reconfigures everything. And at the
Yeah.
time, you couldn't have imagined it, but retroactively, you can kind of fit it in. But at the time, it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
That's kind of apocalypse. Apocalypse is the politics of the event, and Foucault was more representing that. And I say I'm not a Foucaultian, but for Foucault, everything is power. That's his thing, really. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's what
and
I
there's
gather.
always place where, and but his politics is indirect because he kind of says indirectly, as you see how power flows, and as you see how some people have all of it and other people have virtually none of it, um, that creates a productive antagonism that eventually, hopefully, um, ends up with power being more equally distributed. So that's what Foucault is arguing, I think, in a nutshell.
But you can't get equal power, right? You can't have that with so many
Yeah.
people. We have too many people. How do you enforce that? You have to have some sort of a big state, some sort of an army that keeps everyone equal and makes sure that they don't own anything. And they can't, then if they want jobs that are outside of like what they are specifically needed to do to ensure the equality of everyone, they're not allowed to do that. I'm trying to come up with a name for this, but I think it's a good
Yes.
idea, and I think it's
It sounds like a
worked.
very brave new world. Yeah, I like
It
it.
sounds like a brave new world. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, what
What's
did
the
you?
brave
So
new
where's
world
you? Yeah. Oh, that's basically what that is you're describing. Well, it
Communism.
wasn't by force. It was by everybody. I think whenever you were born, you're kind of given chemicals, and either the chemicals made
Nice.
you a bit dumb so that you could be a worker, or you'd be smart. But everything was controlled, so you would have your place in society, um,
Nice.
and be happy. You would own nothing and be happy, as
You'll
they
own
say.
nothing and you'll be happy.
Yeah. I was
Um,
thinking, by the way, that some, although Foucault is very much beloved by kind of a certain form of contemporary kind of what's called leftism, I think a lot of people on the right could like Foucault as well, because a lot of people on the right have a real sensitivity to how university and government and corporations can be manipulating us, and media can manipulate us.
yes.
So when I was watching it, I was like, actually, it's not that, you know, people on the right or left would kind of have different feelings of Foucault. I think they could all find something they would agree with in Foucault, which is in different. They may see different kind of like guilty parties, but on both sides of the political divide in America, I think people are quite aware of how um, supposedly neutral or benevolent institutions can actually hide very nefarious desires.
Would you say that though that Foucault would say that that's because that it goes back to power, whereas those on the right would probably be it's rather than being an excess of power, sort of a lack of justice or lack of moral. Like they there's an inherent distrust of academia or a lot of expertise on the right, where they don't believe anything. There is that like postmodern, there's no such thing as truth, but it seems like the reason they don't believe anything is because there's an nefarious darkness to these institutions, whereas Foucault would say it's all just a result of unequal power. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, although and Foucault, this is the funny thing, like all the things you just said there used to be on the left. Like the left used to be,
Yeah.
pretty skeptical of the university, definitely of corporations, definitely of the military industrial complex, definitely of educational judicial systems. And so it's kind of funny that that some of those, so I don't know what Foucault would think of this. In some respects he might be quite surprised, but because but you're right, Foucault doesn't see power as good or bad, and that's someone like Jordan Peterson says this, like, Foucault thinks it's all about like power and powerlessness, and but Foucault in a way he's saying no, power is not good or bad, it just is. Like he's a kind of Nietzschean in that way. It's just all there is in reality, not just in us but in being itself, is a will, and that will is kind of like focused in different ways and can be come out in bad ways and good ways, but really power is just an ontological
Yeah.
reality. Yeah. But it's bad whenever it gets, it gets so controlled by some group, and at the expense of others. That's where it kind of becomes destructive and violent.
Malignant.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Everything is good in moderation, but if there's too much of it, welcome to the Fundamentalists, everyone, where we drop these incredible truth bombs on you.
Yes.
It's all this stuff just wrinkles my brain. It's very fun. I don't know if you were getting. Were you going to ask where I'm falling between the Chomsky?
Oh yes, I was. It kind of, yeah. In terms
I
of
don't know.
all of this, yeah.
I don't know. I like the postmodern thing of I think each individual has the capability of trying both hats on at the same time. I'm not going to be a Foucaultian when I go into the voting booth. I'm going to do what most benefits the material realities of people. I'm not going to be like, well, I'm not going to be like I'm not going to not vote for this guy because this guy still upholds the system, if that makes any sense. I'll still vote for the guy. That guy. By guy, I mean DeSantis, but...
Yeah, well, see, that's a difficult thing, is like, because voting, it'd be interesting to talk about that in the next while.
It is.
Yeah.
There is like a... I guess because it's so tied into the politics stuff that where I am I'm viewing this through my political brain, and it is like I do feel like there's a cop out that can happen with some of this stuff where all of a sudden it like, maybe I kind of do agree with a little what Chomsky says, that it does get a little overly simplified. Maybe that's a mischaracterization of Foucault's stuff, but then at the same time, Foucault, like you're saying, opens up this whole new line of inquiry that makes total sense, and that is another way of creating a more, what Chomsky would say, just society. I don't know. I'm really not the person to ask. I think what I find impressive is you can actually talk about these things and know what each person thinks. Like I'm surprised you didn't say the word deontology at some point. I expected that one to come out, and I'm still not. I'm still confused on what that word means. No, utilitarianism.
Oh, right. Yes, well, I've only been doing this for 3 decades, so...
Exactly, yeah. You've had time to read.
Yeah, I've had time to read. I've had a lot of time to read. Like, in terms of Chomsky, like, I am sympathetic, not even sympathetic. I agree with Chomsky that language, I mean, it's even saying agreeing is silly, because it just seems, I think it is just the case. Like, there is something about language that is innate within us, and the issue for me, and I think this is what Foucault was subtly saying, was, for me, it's not substantive. Like, language arises because something is missing. Human beings have an experience of a question
words,
an unknowing.
Was it?
Yeah. What's that?
You said language arises because something is missing, and I said, was it words?
That's very good. Although, that's a very niche comedy set if you're doing post-structuralist stand-up.
Yeah, that's my I was so proud of my postmodern joke. Is it true? Who's to say? I think is I'll absolutely gonna kill. My third comedy special is gonna be just as funny.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Mhm.
so what were you saying? I cut you off. Yes, a
Oh yeah,
language arises from a lack, basically. That's
I
the
like.
a
Yeah, so
Lacanian.
Yeah, so if so in one way there is some sort of universal. I think that's what Chomsky is hitting on. Chomsky's hitting on something, but I do think Fuku's right. Like once you take that negative and then you turn it in. So if you watch the debate at first, it's just a kind of sense of we have this universal innate ability to uh, speak and speak creatively, and then by the end of the debate, Chomsky is saying. Like I know what justice is, not completely, but we can know what justice is, and it's different from the law sometimes. And when the law isn't just, we're legally allowed to break the law. And he's making some very kind of like big statements about jurisprudence, about legal theory, and I think they are connected. I think it's interesting. He starts off with this very innocuous kind of, oh, there's a human nature, there's something, and by the end of it, he's saying, I know what ideal society looks like, anarcho-syndicalism, and I have a pretty good idea what justice looks like. Now, that's, as I say, he doesn't say it completely. He says there's always a risk when we try to describe justice. There's always a risk that we do the wrong thing, but he does move, and that's what Foucault continues to resist in the debate. Right the way through the debate, Foucault's going, let's critique, but be very wary about human nature, ideal society, a true science that gives us absolute access to reality, justice. Those are,
It's like
that's what, yeah.
yeah, it's like the Foucault just does this saying away, or it's like a apophatic kind of deal of like you
Mhm.
can say what's wrong, but you can't be, what is it, proscriptive? Is that the word? Where when you
Yeah.
start saying like actively where to go rather than just how to course correct? Is that kind of what
Yes.
you say?
Yeah, like you're right to bring in the theology. So there's the cataphatic, the positive, what you can say, and the apophatic, which is you can only say
Yeah.
what you can't say. And so, yeah, in a way, Foucault and a lot of postmodernist stuff is a type of philosophical apophatism. Um, and the question is, and it's a big question, bit too big for this episode, but is that can you build a positive political project out of this apophatic approach? And so Chomsky, I think, is saying no, ultimately no, and then Foucault is kind of saying no, you can.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't see how you could, but I'm not the one to.
Yeah.
I don't know how to get very many people excited, but maybe I'm wrong. So
Well,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, maybe, but evolution's a good example. Evolution does not have, if it doesn't have a
Yes, that's a great example.
teleological dimension, yeah. But what it does is it has constant change and antagonism, and that can, over time, with a bit of luck or whatever, create complexity and diversity. So, in one sense, evolution is a form of non-teleological biological development. So, could you apply that to the political?
The potential for there to be teleology in evolution is not a closed debate. So I don't know if you've read a
Uh,
little book called Answers in Genesis.
I've watched quite a lot of their stuff of late.
Yeah.
I've very
Uh,
much enjoyed it. Yeah.
but yeah, that's all. Let's do a little fun game here to close it out, though, Pete.
Mm.
If you unless you have something else, because I
Oh
think
yeah, no, let's do it.
it's been it's been a lot of years since this landmark debate between Alfred Foucault and Jeremy Chomsky. They had a lot of disagreements. It covered four sections: human nature, society, ideal society, and justice. Is that correct?
Yeah, science
Those
was
are
the
the
second one. Sorry, but yeah.
science. I wrote the wrong word. I thought that was kind of lame how they made society and then ideal society. It's two separate sections. Okay, so what's one sentence each? We're gonna recreate the debate using
Okay.
our own stances on things. One, describe human nature. Pete, you first. Then I'll go after you.
We are all lacking subjects.
Okay, great. I was gonna say you and me ain't nothing but mammals. Was my answer. Uh, Science. Can you describe science?
Science is a type of uh, a particular type of revealing of reality that also conceals.
Okay, I was gonna say it's the pursuit of material truth through trial and error. Um,
Yep.
and then there's ideal society. What do you think ideal society is?
uh, a danger to avoid. To
Very
don't
close.
try to avoid
Okay.
utopianism.
An
What's
ideal
yours?
society is one in which 3 goddesses created a land called Hyrule and bestowed it upon the goddess Hylia, who was then attacked by Calamity Ganon, who is currently being held in the castle by Princess Zelda.
So that's either Greek mythology or a computer game. Which one's that? Is that? It sounds like
a
Greek
computer
mythology.
game. Okay, you sound like Chomsky. You sound like an old Chomsky talking to the computer game. Yeah, it is a computer game. You're right. Justice. What do you think justice is?
Yeah, justice is a type of regulative ideal that kind of like we never grasp, but we attempt to is a promise that we can never grasp, that motivates us.
Okay, I was gonna say it's when nice things happen to me, so that's close enough.
Brilliant. There's the debate. We just had our own version of it. Yeah.
I hope it gets as many hits. Yeah. This has been fun. I mean, I like this. This is a really heady one, so I hope people enjoyed it because it's not as sexy. But I'm still. I don't know how much more I learned about Chomsky. I don't know that he's someone that I'm gonna dive into. Foucault, I look forward to learning more about Foucault. So maybe that's a good litmus test: is which one I'm now more interested in, and I would say Foucault.
Yeah. It revived my interest in him because I'm not big into him, but actually I really enjoyed the debate and so I always worry because I say that post-structuralist thing sometimes can, as you say, degenerate into a type of constant deferral in which events can't happen. It's just kind of constant kind of play with words and meaning is never directly grasped and all of that. So I get that critique. But then at the end of the day, also he's a very clear writer for the French. I mean, the French philosophers aren't very clear, but he's one of the clearer ones.
Nice.
And
it also, I think, it leaves out that this stuff's really fun sometimes. All that real heady stuff when you're, that stuff that you spent the last 30 years doing, it can be fun.
Yeah.
It turns out.
Yeah.
Huh. All right. That's all. I'm just riffing.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. And if you want to support the podcast, head to patreon.com/thefundamentalists. It helps us out. And I'm going to go see if Pete can scream loud enough for my dad to hear him from his ship room, I guess.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. See you, everybody.